and a warm welcome to the CNBC Africa special on the economics of rolling out and maintaining fibre networks. I'm Kukuletu Cele. Now, down the years, we've seen these companies digging trenches and laying cables across South African cities. According to BMI TechKnowledge, South Africa is likely to have more than 360,000 active fibre-to-home connections by the year 2019. That'll make the internet access a lot faster. Now, it's a very competitive and dynamic industry, and in studio with me, I have the main competitors in this fibre network industry in South Africa who have downed their tools and come out of their trenches for a discussion on fibre economics. In studio, we're joined by Prenesh Padayachee, MD of Wholesale Services at Openserve, Niel Schoeman, founder and CEO of Vumatel, Marten Scheffer, who's the GM of Network Engineering at Neotel, and Abraham van der Merwe, MD of Frogfoot Networks. There we go. Bit of a tongue twister there, but we managed to get it in. But at least the fibre optics that are under the ground actually aren't as twisted as my tongue is at the moment. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. We do know from a fundamental perspective that we do need broadband access across the country. The Minister of Telecommunications as well as Postal Services, Minister Cwele, has alluded to the fact that we need broadband access to help us aid in accomplishing the economic developments that we need to see in the country. Prenesh, perhaps if I start with you and going across the table to get all of your opening comments, how important is broadband access in order for a country like South Africa to tap into and unlocking opportunities to help boost the economy?
So, Gugleto, I think vitally important, and basically on the fact that fibre or broadband access has helped change GDPs and economies around the world. As we start to get much more of an online population going, I think some of the socio-economic factors that we tend to face in South Africa or across the African continent, those will start to change over time. But just something else that I find really, really interesting, that we talk about broadband, and over the years, broadband has become a technology about speed rather than what broadband really is, and maybe later on in the discussion we'll go into that. We tend to get hung up, I think, on the speed conversation more than anything else.
Neil, let's get your views and opening remarks as well with regard to this particular technology, using it to enable economic development.
Yeah, I think Prenesh is right. It's vital for this country to actually get increase in penetration of broadband and also an increase in speed. At the moment, we're sort of one of the most expensive countries in the world in terms of broadband speeds, and we don't have this interim technology like cable TV or whatever the interim technologies were available like they had in Europe or in the US. And that's made us lag behind the rest of the economy. And I think there's some studies that's shown by the World Bank, etc., which I think Prenesh has alluded to. 10% increase in penetration results in like 3% GDP growth, and we need to make this leap forward in its infrastructure. It's good for the country and also impact the socio-economic problems we face today.
Martin, your opening remarks?
Yes, thanks, Guleta. I think the like was said, the link between GDP and the investment in broadband is very clear at the moment. You see very big companies like Google and fiber hoods and all kinds of things developing exactly to develop the economy. South Africans, I think, can rightfully be a bit excited about fiber to the home and should really see this as a very positive thing. We've seen some very innovative solutions getting into neighborhoods and solutions of deploying fiber at lower costs and getting into households and so forth. And I think we might just be at the beginning of a perfect storm with content and other items, coming together. We finally, I think, in South Africa have the international connectivity, the domestic fiber networks, and now going into the household. And it's been a long time coming.
Abraham, let's get your view.
Yes, I think fiber is a quantum leap in terms of the speeds that we can achieve and the stability that we can achieve. And as we just have this perfect storm right now of home users and business users making use of new applications and technologies that rely on these networks that we have. So and that is growing phenomenally, and everything that we take for granted is relying on this infrastructure. So we entering this age of the Internet of Things, where we have every device in our house communicating over the internet. We have our content such as video on demand that is now being streamed over the internet. We have our voice that is starting to be streamed over the internet, and so we are becoming so reliant on the internet that we really need this technology as a foundation to build on.
I want to piggyback off of one of the opening statements that Prenesh made, which is certainly the definition of this broadband element, which some might argue that fibre plays a role and an influence in that regard. Let's perhaps start off on a happier note that according to the My Broadband Q1 survey for 2016, I think you'll be happy to note that Telkom, Vumatel, together with Neotel, have been voted as one of, or the top three best service providers when it does come to broadband penetration and access in South Africa. Frogfoot Networks, I think you might be making your way there in good time. But let's talk about that. When we talk about this great access to broadband, the role of fibre within that level of connectivity, how important and how critical is it, and perhaps a broader definition and understanding of the two elements at play here?
So, if I can, so the way I see this is when we look at broadband and we want to start looking at how we connect people itself, I think fibre gives us those advantages on it's not prone to things like wet cables, those types of things, electrical interference on the cable itself. And then some of the other factors that play into this as well. So we have a large problem in South Africa regarding copper theft and what we do around copper theft and those types of things. So I think if there's enough of an education program around this, we'll start to move away from those types of elements. The other thing I think that fibre gives you, it gives you a really easy degree of the ability to be able to increase bandwidth and decrease bandwidth without having to do large investments in infrastructure in the back end to be able to do this type of technology. So I think those are the factors that are at play here, where the ease of use. So the way I like to look at broadband is it should become a utility service, and very similar to on if you want extra water, you open up the tap much more than you would normally. Those are the sort of things. So it should be something that when you buy a new house or when you move into a new premises, you expect the lights and water to work, you should expect your broadband to work in a similar fashion. And it should be easy, I think, to get there.
We'll get there in a moment as well, because I do want to understand the way in which you've done this, Neil, because clearly Vumatel, you've been in the headlines for all the right reasons, it does seem, penetrating particular suburbs within the city of Johannesburg and creating the demand. So it almost seems as though you're providing a service to consumers even though they don't really know that they need it. Like you allude to, we want the water at whatever pace we're getting it at, but does it often have to start with providers like yourselves to create that awareness for consumers?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a little bit of a catch-22. Without the access, there's very little services that people are prepared to deliver over the infrastructure, and without the content, there's really very little need, for example. And we tried to break that nexus, and I think the timing is perfect. Content is now coming, Showmax, Netflix, you know, all of these sort of, let's call it the cream sodas and whiskies running through the pipes to your home, you know, where you can actually start to utilize the technology a lot more and for what it is being used. The technology is extremely future-proof because it's traveling at the speed of light. So it's really dependent on the equipment that you put on the ends of these beautiful strands of glass that gets to your home. So it's, you know, it will last another 60, 100 years and we'll still probably use the infrastructure at that particular point in time. So it's a leap forward. It gives access to the consumers to a lot of new services and opportunities for over-the-top services, etc. And I think it's important that we do that. Important that we break this nexus, really.
Martin, you wanted to add to that?
Well, you know, Neotel entered a while back into the network space, the carrier network space, and we decided very early to differentiate by using fibre. Fibre is such an incredible differentiator. You know, it's really the thing of the future. You know, personally, I think the cellular and the wireless solutions have a very, very specific place, mobility and so forth. But fixed broadband penetration and fibre penetration to the home and to the population is extremely important for the economy. It's measured by many entities worldwide as an indicator, you know, of developed and developed nations. And you know, you mentioned the My Broadband. Neotel was lucky enough to win the My Broadband Best Fibre Broadband Fixed Broadband product, and it is really something that differentiates in a market. We're incumbent. You know, we had to go against an incumbent, and frankly, that was it starts with a challenger mentality, and the challenger, of course, has to catch up, and the differentiator is really through fibre.
If fibre is a differentiator and the new kid on the block that can perform all these wonders, what does this mean then for ADSL, which in many South African homes and even companies is still quite relevant? Prenesh, as well as Martin, maybe give your views, and Abraham, feel free to jump in there.
So I think there's still a massive market for DSL. We have a large, as Telkom or Openserve, we have a large copper footprint out there, and I think we need to be able to utilize that. But as we utilize the copper footprint, I also think we need to start looking at how do we get fiber deeper into the network so we start to get higher bandwidth speeds across the copper infrastructure. So some of the things that we face today with copper is that we have long sort of runs at the end of the network, and by the technologies used for that, we then find that you can't really get to the higher bandwidth speeds. So I think a combination of copper and fiber will allow you to get to the higher bandwidth speeds, and then it comes down to a usage type scenario. What do you really want to use your broadband connectivity for? Are you streaming multiple high definition channels? Are you doing software downloads? Are the kids just doing research for homework? Those types of things, and that's where the convenience factor comes in. So I think in the future there's definitely a place for both of these technologies. And as we start to move further down that road, I think the lower bandwidth speeds that you see on copper will start to vanish as we move to the higher speeds on it, with the combination of fiber in that infrastructure.
Is there still a place for mobile?
I think so. I think there is, mobile fills a need which is by definition someone on the move, where people work and live and play and so forth. But on the other side, I have to say that shows we haven't answered the question correctly in South Africa yet, because our broadband penetration is not what it should be compared to others, and we've had very successful mobile rollouts in South Africa, LTE and so forth. I think the answer to the broadband penetration question can really only be through fixed broadband, and eventually I think all of that leads to fibre.
I take it this takes the discussion as well to the broader South African view, because when it does come to fibre, we do see it being rolled out in many of the metros across South Africa, as well as very urban areas. But if we are looking to get everybody in the country connected, does it then call for that multi-pronged approach where there is a role and a place for all of these different technologies to exist? Abra?
I think fibre is the enabler for everything else. So, I mean, as a technology, if we just simply compare it through each strand of fibre, I mean, it really represents the spectrum that we have available for all other technologies combined. So, I mean, any mobile technology we can modulate over one piece of strand of fibre, and when we deploy fibre, we deploy a sleeve with multiple ducts and tubes, and within that multiple fibre strands. So we're really building this universe of connectivity in each trench of fibre that we're deploying. So all the other technologies are really dependent on it. If we take mobile LTE, for example, we all want access to LTE because we are mobile and we have devices that we carry with us that we need decent connectivity for. But as our demand for applications are rising and we need more capacity, we need to bring those base stations closer to the subscriber, and we also need to power those base stations by fibre so that we can actually aggregate all this capacity to the service providers and to the internet. So really, I mean, whenever we have a conversation about any technology, it all boils down to it's backed by fibre. So it is not a technology that should be viewed on its own. I mean, all these other technologies, there is a need for it, and there's a use for it, especially mobile technologies, but it is deployed in conjunction with fibre.
Let's get back to this conversation regarding this miracle child, which enables and carries so much of this access with regard to broadband penetration. Clearly, it starts off with identifying the areas in which you're going to roll out these materials in, the costs affiliated together with the strategies that you implement, as you alluded to, Prenesh, making sure that the systems are in sync in order to allow for this broadband to be accessed. But Niel, I'd like to come to you for a moment just to use Vumatel as an example. First step, identifying the particular areas in which you move into. We've touched very briefly on the demand element as well with regard to the consumer, but are urban areas the primary facilities and organizations and places that we're trying to target when it comes to fiber rollout, like the Parkhurst example?
I think our approach is really to try and fibre up the metros, the main metros, Johannesburg and Cape Town, over the next couple of years. I think it's a natural evolution for private sector to deploy infrastructure. You start at the apex of affordability. We build it in a logical way to say that suburb A needs to be next to suburb B because it's easier to manage. It doesn't help us to do one in Uppington and one in Knysna. And the network sort of grows organically. And yes, it's the income profiles, it's the density, the sizes of the homes, the stands, etc., which all determines obviously the cost to lay it out. And there's sort of a happy Goldilocks sort of spot where, you know, the distances between the homes versus the income profile, etc., can at the moment afford fibre because it is expensive. But we will see that the prices will come down because obviously it's sort of critical mass that will be reached. There's inflection points where costs takes another leap down, and the price will come down. But eventually, to get to the rural areas, which is obviously one of the key questions ultimately, I think for the private sector to try and tackle that in isolation at the moment probably does not make financial sense. It doesn't mean that private sector can't do it, but I think that's where private sector and government sector will need to have to work together by subsidizing it to a degree, whatever the case may be. And this has worked very successfully in Europe and the States. But at the moment, we're just not doing enough in that regard. But obviously, it's early days, and the main cities need to be built.
The main cities are also seeing quite a lot of competition here because you've got yourself targeting specific areas. Telkom also with a lot of demand from gated communities, as we also see with one of your other competitors, Metro Fibre, if I'm not mistaken. Is there enough room for all of you here at the table and many others out there who want to get a piece of the pie? In other words, is there not an opportunity here for the market to get oversaturated? Marten, Abraham?
So, I mean, with all competitive markets, I mean, we see a land grab and then eventually some form of maturity, and then there will be some over competition, then some. But I think where we are now, really, I mean, we have so much to cover. It's really if you take South Africa in the 1960s and we had to build roads throughout the country. I mean, it took 10 years with the largest construction fleet in the world to actually build the roads that we have. So we are right now sitting in a situation where we need to deploy these virtual roads with fibre, and there's just so much to do. So I think we don't even have enough competitors to deploy the fibre.
Is that an invite out there to someone who's listening? I'm not too sure if you'll all welcome it though, but Marten, give us your view. Pranesh, Neil, feel free.
Yeah, I think it needs to be said that, you know, the fibre to the home is a very dangerous business model. It's been shown in many countries, in Europe especially, that most of these fibre deployments, the companies that went to the home first went bankrupt and then someone came and made them profitable. And it's all about fill rate. It's all about the number of houses you pass and the number you connect. And most business models are based at the moment at 20%. So it means you pass 5 houses and you connect 1. So it's quite if something goes wrong on the cost, or something goes wrong on the content, or your costs are unpredictable and uncontrollable, then really this could go badly wrong. And you know, I think what Abraham said as well, that eventually you have a land grab and then consolidation is inevitable. You know, I hope we can avoid such a negative cycle in South Africa. You know.
I totally disagree.
Tell us why, Neil.
I know Neotel was the second fixed line operator, and they had the opportunity to go into fibre to the home, and they decided to go to fibre to the business because for these fears, I suppose. The reality is everybody looks towards the States and Europe, etc., when these initial fibre to the home networks were deployed. And they were deployed in the late 1999s when the internet bubble was there and everybody had this great dream of what's going to happen and how quickly it's going to transform. But what people forget is that these interim technologies like cable, etc., were in place. So it's very difficult for that leap, for the customer to make a leap from ADSL to cable, etc. And I mean, we know, and hence we're deploying as fast as we possibly can, and I'm sure Prenesh knows now as well, that the consumers are extremely interested in this service and the uptake is fantastic. it is important that we do this, and I think if you look at the Eastern European countries where there wasn't the interim technology, 50% is more the reasonable uptake of the service that you should look at, rather than the 20% services where you look at where there was the interim technology available. So, and I suppose all the competitors are now finding out for themselves as they deploy the networks. Obviously, you need to do it efficiently and at a price point which makes sense for the consumer. But to be honest, it's a no-brainer in a sense.
Yeah, if I can just add to what Niel's saying, I think we have definitely found that there's definitely a strong business case for fibre, at least for the first operator within a suburb. So the question really is just, is there a business case for a second and a third and a fourth? And I think the economics starts breaking down once you have multiple operators within a suburb. But there's definitely an insatiable demand for fibre in South Africa at the moment. And I think for as long as we have areas that do not have fibre, there will always be a business case for new competitors. I think that's really...
What does that mean for... Go ahead, Prenesh.
So I just want to touch on the infrastructure part. So I agree that we shouldn't all be building in the same area. But if you just go back to some of the figures that you spoke about earlier on, 360,000 fibre users by 2019. We live in a country of 50 million people. What happens to the other 49 million and odd people? So I think we're starting to look at this and say, yes, we need fibre, but the way we're deploying fibre, and that's because of the economics of fibre and sort of business model and shareholder return and all those types of things, we tend to look at deploying fibre in the niche high LSM areas. That's not going to change the GDP of the country. And I think that's the important point. We need to start to get fibre out to the other areas to fundamentally change the GDP. Because those high LSM areas have connectivity in any event currently. All we're doing is we're changing their technology to give them high speed technology.
But what if I come back to you and I say, as the chief executive of any of these large firms that roll out the fibre, I want to maintain profitability first. Sure, I want to help grow the economy, but fundamentally I've got shareholders backing me. So primary areas I should be targeting are the Parkhurst, the Sandtons, the Kyalamis of South Africa. Is that still an objective?
It's still an objective, and it becomes a balancing act. Going forward becomes a balancing act. So if you look at the competition and how we kind of roll out on competition, it'll be foolish for all of us to go and build in the same areas. We need to start to look at, and the real money in this game is on the services you run on the fibre, not the fibre itself. So once you start to look at how you make money on the services portion of this, that's where the dials start to change. The economics in the fibre part and the profits on the fibre part, obviously depending on how efficient your operation is, there's very small margins in those types of entities. So if you look at two people deploying in a suburb, all you're really going to do is really cut down your own margins. When at an open access basis on fibre, you then start to look at, are the other service providers starting to connect to that fibre network? Because the fibre network on its own doesn't make sense to the end user.
How do we get that right then? Does this mean that there's some kind of partnership that we might see evolving with large companies like Showmax together with Netflix in order to enable that content to flow through the fibres? Is that a conversation that's happening now?
I think it's important to realize that, I mean, this is like a war. You first have to establish a beachhead before you can progress. So really, I mean, we have to all, as a competitor, start somewhere in deploying fibre somewhere. So yes, we cherry pick the areas where we're most likely to show profitability and have success. But as the competition increases and we start establishing these beachheads, we'll eventually see that spreading into the more rural areas, because ultimately once you've saturated an area, you have to move on to a new area. So the demand is always there. So I think as long as we deploying fibre and we're increasing the number of competitors, we will see eventually this spreading to rural areas.
If we can, maybe can we talk about the targets? I know Vumatel, you're looking at 200,000 homes in the next 3 to 4 years. Telkom, 500,000 homes by the end of this year. Are these targets still in line? Neotel and Frogfoot Networks, from your perspective, how many businesses and homes do you still look to target? You can correct me on those figures if they are incorrect.
We are targeting 150,000 in the next year and a half.
And you believe that that target will be met, the demand is there, as you continue to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we believe the market is in total possibly 2 million to 3 million households. That really means that we've only touched the top of the the easy addressable market, not really going into the rural areas and so forth. You know, we've had fantastic cooperation with wireless ISPs, and I have to mention them, although we're talking about fiber. You know, that just showed us that you have these wireless. You have about 500 of them in South Africa, all operating in rural areas, all focusing on towns and so forth, and really focusing on a town and servicing them well. It shows me that there's absolutely no alternative but to know your customer well and to service them for their needs. Now, whether that is in a rural area or whether that's in a Parkhurst, I don't think it makes a huge difference. There is, of course, a return of investment, but often the rural costs are lower as well. You know, getting there is actually quite a big step. You know, I mean, we've deployed about 10,000 kilometers of metro fiber. We pass 1,500 suburbs, and about 98,000 users are on our fiber within reach. And that is still a fraction of 2 million, you know. So there's so much more to be done, even in rural areas.
If the pie is this big and different players are looking for particular markets, would it be advisable then perhaps to split up the areas according to who has the most amount of capital to be able to deploy? Neil, you completely disagree. Or again, do we just fight for it? First entrant into the market and you get the pick.
I think you need to have competition. To be frank, this is kicked off when we started last year in Parkhurst and set a marker down to say that we are going to fibre up 100,000, 200,000 homes over the next 2 years, which obviously got some of the competitors that are incumbents on the ADSL side to have to move.
Are you the reason why Prenesh and Marten are having sleepless
nights? I think to a degree, and that's the beauty of competition. You know, we are fighting out there in the trenches, I suppose. It will be silly for us to duplicate infrastructure, for sure. I mean, why double the capital and half the market and we serve one area less? But competition is great. I mean, we're under price pressures, etc., and that's what's going to make it move forward. If we really divvy it up and sort of take a nice and easy approach to this, I think we will just set everybody back, to be honest.
Gentlemen, on that note, we're going to take a quick ad break, but when we return, it's gloves off as we talk about those price pressures and again, fighting for market share as well as area codes here in South Africa when it comes to increasing fiber connection in South Africa. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to the CNBC Africa special on the economics of rolling out and maintaining fiber networks. Now, still with me in studio, I have Prenesh Padayachee from Openserve, Niel Schoeman from Vumatel, Marten Scheffer, who's from Neotel, and Abraham van der Merwe from Frogfoot Networks. Gentlemen, we're still participating in the conversation where competition is clearly the name of the game. And just a moment ago, before the ad break, we touched on costs as well very briefly. Neil, let me start with you again here, because you mentioned that as it's an exciting industry, some people are having sleepless nights, and these sleepless nights will continue as the cost pressures also continue to mount. I understand you've recently approved 160 million rand of projects to go ahead. You're looking to raise a further 500 million rand on the market. And according to some headlines and reports, it costs around 400 rand a meter to lay down these fibers. I'm not too sure if it's correct. You can go ahead and correct me. But fundamentally, this is a very expensive game. And the more players that there are in the market, it seems as though the feathers will be rattled a little bit further.
Yeah, I think that number is probably not far off from the general average in the marketplace. So in our case, we'll probably deploy about 1 billion rand this year. I think some of the other players would do similarly, and the mobile operators and Telkom will probably have deeper pockets. And
that's not a little bit of money. Where is this capital coming from?
It's coming from the private sector, from investors. We obviously had equity injection from Investec and earlier this year. So there's a lot of sources of funds available to deploy into infrastructure. It's a longer term return, perhaps, but you know, it has infrastructure type of returns, and it's got a long life, the asset that we're putting in the ground. So it's expensive, but as scale comes on board, the cost goes down. We have manufacturing facilities being set up in South Africa now for fiber, so rather than importing it, etc. And between all of us, we're stimulating this market, and effectively we're all bringing the price down by creating volume in the marketplace. Which obviously is important to bring the cost down over time.
almost sounds to me as though we're working with a J curve here, where the growth prospects are still quite far out. But perhaps if you can paint a picture of the kind of returns that as investors you are anticipating to see. Abraham, you're smiling there. Perhaps you can engage us further?
Well, I don't think we can go as far as sharing our return on investment. But as Neil said, the cost for deployment is roughly 400 to 600 Rand a meter. For us, I think a more important metric in terms of cost is really tracking the cost per home passed and the cost per home connected. But there are many factors to take into account. So really the metrics that we are tracking is what is the average revenue per user? So how much can we actually get from a customer that signs up for the service? Then the penetration within a suburb, what percentage? So there's obviously a big difference if you have 20% penetration versus 70% penetration. So that's a very important metric as well. So I think the success of any fiber deployment is really measured by how fast can we achieve high penetration, what is the revenues that we can achieve, and how can we maintain those revenues in a deflationary environment. And then as a third leg to that is the cost. But the cost is not the be-all and the end-all. It's one of the three metrics that we have to track.
I would assume, though, that for players which are like Vumatel and Frogfoot Networks, it's slightly more difficult in order to get this capital and roll out and manage your margins versus your larger competitors on the market.
I think as Neil mentioned and as proven, I mean, the capital is there. I think that the investment is not the concern. It's really actually gaining ground quickly, proving that you can deliver and showing that you can deliver a service that customers want. I think anybody that can show that they can deliver and can actually achieve a profitable business model can get funding very easily.
Marten, does this worry you at all?
No, I think
you welcome the competition.
Yeah, no, listen, that's what I'm supposed to say, isn't it? So I'm very glad to hear my colleagues are building at double our cost. That was quite a good comment. I would say probably the biggest point I'd like to make there is that there is a significant amount of cost in the environment that you're going into. For instance, overhead cost. On overhead pylons, stringing it along and so forth, using metropolitan infrastructure like overhead power, which is already in many of these suburbs, and so forth, brings your cost down literally by about a half, if not more, about a third, Being able to enter into homes overhead or cleating on the side of the wall or something like that is also extremely cheap compared to the underground solutions. Often, like we saw in the cellular environment, the same people that really are desperate for the service don't like the towers. We have the same situation here, that the same people that really want the broadband insist on probably the highest spec of fiber connectivity that you can find in the market.
Which causes problems, I understand, with electricity outages.
Yes, and you know what, and it's quite difficult to work underground. You go through it's not regulated, fiber is not regulated, but certainly there's right-of-ways, there's other utilities to think about and so forth. All of this brings the cost higher and higher and higher. We've experimented a lot with very low-cost solutions, going overhead into homes, overhead through suburbs. Of course, the only question is, aesthetically, can you do this in many of the suburbs? I think if you really go and look at the infrastructure deployed already, leafy suburban, older suburbs have a lot of trees and so forth, you would hardly notice this overhead infrastructure.
Something else that you have been in the media commenting on very recently, Neil, is that 90% naturally of the technology is imported. And we all saw the significant blowout in the currency taking place towards the end of last year, despite the significant depreciation over 2015 in itself. Is this not compounding the headache of the costs associated with bidding down this fiber?
It clearly doesn't help. But the biggest component of the cost is still labor, where we're still in a fortunate position in South Africa where labor is relatively cheap. But yes, I think it's about 30% of the cost would be imported, of the total cost would be imported material, which is sensitive to market fluctuations. So if the rand had to depreciate by about 10%, it would make 3% impact on our total cost to deploy. So yes, and it obviously can go scary if things get out of hand, but the biggest portion is still labour ultimately, and if you can be efficient there, you can keep the cost intact, I suppose.
Prenesh, from your perspective?
I just want to touch on the competition thing, because I think it's important. So as the competitors in the market increase, one of the things that we always have to bear in mind, and this kind of alludes to what everyone was talking about, how it pushes up the cost of deploying the infrastructure, because the skill set in fibre isn't oozing out of the woodwork here. And the problem we're going to end up having is that as there are a limited amount of resources deploying fibre, and more fibre players come into the market, and all of us start to deploy fibre in different areas, all that will really end up happening is that the people deploying the fibre or contracted to deploy the fibre will just push up their prices, because it's an opportunity to make extra money in an environment where it's a short-lived environment as we roll out fibre. This fibre rollout plan isn't going to be something that rolls out over the next 10 or 15 years. We're sort of looking at about 3 to 5 years sort of program for all those lucrative areas to be covered, and where the intensive labor force, so as Neil was talking about, it is a labor intensive game, and the ability to connect and maintain that fibre is in a restricted amount of workforce to do that. So we have to balance out those two things on, as the competition in the market increases and more people find it lucrative to install fibre, that skill set for people to install fibre becomes problematic, and as a result the input cost of fibre go up.
Yeah, I must add though that it never ceases to amaze me how competitors engineer around these kind of problems. So yes, I mean, using conventional trenching with the type of contractors that we've all become accustomed to use, I mean, certainly there is not enough skills, but I mean, that doesn't mean that we can't employ different trenching. We can do overhead, we can do sewers and stormwater, we can do micro trenching, so we can dive deeper into the value chain and start creating and building those skills. So I think as long as there's a commercial model and there's enough competition, competitors will find ways to actually keep up with the demand.
Martin, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think what we've seen over the history now, the items to avoid, and Neil made a very good point that if you had to choose between labour and not, and mechanical methods and so forth, instinctively an engineer would probably, like this big Vermeer massive machine that cuts through the road and so forth. But we've actually found that for many reasons, including employment of people and subcontractors and so forth, the use of manual labor and so forth is actually better than mechanical. The costs and so forth are better. Of course, it also protects you against foreign exposure of exchange rate, because these big machines are massive. Their spares come at a dollar price. Their imports, there's not many of them available even. While it's so much more pleasing to employ teams of people that produce good quality work. We've got about 19 subcontractors now, which are almost completely dedicated to Neotel and do very little else work for anyone else, because we roll out a lot of fibre every day, for service delivery purposes and so on.
On these skills, if there is such a significant shortage, what then, as players in the fibre operations, are we doing in order to ensure that we don't have this shortage in future? And more importantly, individuals who can adapt and change to the times, despite the fact that the fibre itself as an investment has a very long term outlook.
So, as Telkom, we've had a great training academy over the years, and what we're doing is, so we have around 30 odd fibre providers in the market, and we've sent them through an intensive training program on the ability to splice fibre, join fibre, roll out fibre, those types of things, and operate and maintain fibre. And what we hope would come out of that going forward is, as more players come into the market, people will have the ability to set up their own industries, to be a contractor to multiple fibre players in the market, and then start to bring that skill set on board. I think, as a South African economy, what we've started to lose track of is the artisanal type trades out there. And I think in the telecoms industry, there's a number of those types of artisanal trades, and we need to start to bring that back into the industry.
To the smaller competitors, is it possible as well to upskill and train individuals like your fellow competitors in the industry do?
Yeah, we follow the same strategy. We have an internal training academy where we take the guys and really skill them up and take them from manual laborers to, you know, maybe technicians and ultimately to real fiber operators. And there's a lot of funding and support out there actually for these little, let's call them bucky brigades or small businesses, which are, you know, which are really their usual problem is a cash flow type of problem rather than a need to do the work or this capacity to do with the work. And really it's not just upskilling technically, it's also upskilling some of these contractors and the subcontractors on business management and to effectively run a small business effectively out there, because we're creating a huge amount of jobs here. I think we must not forget this is infrastructure. It's thousands and thousands of jobs which we desperately need today.
Precisely. We clearly have touched on the point of competition quite extensively on the conversation, and I want to pick up on that. Given the fact that regulation also needs to play some kind of role here, if the environment is going to be this competitive, are we finding that the regulation in South Africa is lagging behind the progressions we see when it comes to rolling out fibre in South Africa? And if so, are there suggestions and recommendations from yourselves as players in this industry with regard to best practice that we need to implement? Marten?
Well, you know, fibre in principle is not regulated. So you
when
don't
you say
need
that, you mean the deployment as well as how
yes,
it's actually...
I mean in the sense that, you know, spectrum, you need a spectrum license for and so forth. You don't need a fibre license. You can deploy fibre. You need a license to light it up, you know, and to deliver services over it and so forth. I think what we really have seen is the access into suburbs, servitudes, metropolitan councils and so forth, managing these right-of-ways, that can improve tremendously. It's really, you know, I always use the example, to connect someone on the same side of the road as what your fibre runs takes about 7 days. To cross the street takes 47 days. And that's 40 days of, you know, right-of-ways and all other types of restrictions. Now, of course, we understand that within the environment, you know, there needs to be some kind of control over the servitudes and the other facilities that are there. But we also find that we're rather good at managing those ourselves, and, you know, probably don't need all this level of control.
Neil, you agree? Prenesh, your views?
Yeah, I think I know there's an initiative underway which is called the Rapid Deployment Guidelines to try and, you know, bridge some of these problems. But the risk is that we're actually going to finish deploying to Joburg before the Rapid Deployment Guidelines actually come.
Which renders it...
So we need to get more rapid with the Rapid Deployment Guidelines. So I think it's just a challenge that the regulations are just not keeping up. You know, the process of adapting regulation in a changing telecoms environment is really just struggling to keep up. I think that everybody's got the same sentiment, but the market's moving much faster than what the regulations are.
I also think there's a couple of other factors at play here as well. Many municipalities are starting to move down the smart city concepts and those types of things. So as a result, they want to do their own fibre deployments. So this is a conundrum for guys doing the street planning and those types of things. I want to deploy my own fibre. I've got 20 or 30 other people wanting to deploy fibre as well. Does my model then work, or what goes on with that? And how do we then start to engage on which is the right model for these types of things? And I think, so as Neil was talking about, the rapid deployment guidelines will help, but unfortunately they'll take quite some time to get there. And if we start to look at it as a utility service, then as we plan new suburbs and new areas, I think that should become part of the planning guideline in any event, because we plan water and electricity infrastructure in any event. So let's start to plan communications infrastructure as part of those development of new suburbs. In metros, we start to plan new suburbs in metros. If you just look at an area like Fourways, it wasn't a major suburb not so long ago. Now, if you look at it, it is a major suburb. And if we had planned communications infrastructure as part of that suburban growth, we wouldn't have had some of the issues we have today.
Yeah, I mean, our experience is also that, I mean, some of our greatest challenges are around council approval, way leaves, and also landlord approvals, not so much in FTTH, but in FTTB at least. But as Neil mentioned, I mean, unfortunately, regulatory intervention in our experience doesn't really help, because it always comes too late and too little. So I think we're already in motion, and we will resolve these challenges long before we actually have a regulatory framework which will assist us in the process.
Having said that, though, are your concerns falling on the right ears, and are they responding appropriately? And secondly, if we're talking about city development as well as urban areas where we use communications as well as a fundamental when it comes to access for all South Africans, doesn't this open up the opportunity then for public-private partnerships? Or will that again disrupt the level of competition that we've begun to see in this industry? Marten?
You know, just to give you an idea of what future planning and town planning and so forth, including fibre, would do, we see about a 7-fold difference in cost if it is planned into the infrastructure. A greenfield development of a suburb or even a business area or so forth is about 7 times cheaper to deploy if it goes in while you're doing the pavements and the roads and the other utilities.
Sure.
So it has a tremendous impact on the deployment, and let's face it, you know, it's the bang for the buck. If you had to spend R1 on something and you get 7 times the result, it's a no-brainer. So the question of public-private partnership, I think, is actually quite a good one. I think there is always a place for social enterprise to service you know, a public need. There is clearly a requirement to, you know, deploy fibre in metro areas and so forth. And if more than one need can you know, synergistically help each other, I think that's a good thing. What I'm personally very critical on is the idea that you know, metro councils and so forth really can deploy fibre efficiently and so forth. They don't call us fibre operators for nothing. It is difficult to deploy, but it's also very difficult to operate. And one questions whether, you know, if your core business is not in this telecommunications, content, broadband game, whether you really can efficiently deploy these. So it's probably better that the metro councils join in partnerships rather than try and do it themselves in competition.
I take it you would all agree on the panel with those sentiments?
Absolutely.
Having said that, though, does this necessarily mean that we might need a certain number, perfect mix of competitors in a specific area in order to ensure that the necessary needs of the consumer are met? Would that ever work?
I think, I mean, capitalism dictates that there will always be an increase in competitors if there's a gap in the market. So I don't think we need to intervene to achieve that. I think market forces will dictate the amount of competition.
Neil, you wanted to add, Prenesh?
So I would definitely agree with that. I think competition is great. As long as the competition starts to warrant cheaper prices to the end user. Those competitive factors need to play down to the user of the bandwidth rather than just competing for the sake of competing. And it needs to have a fundamental change in what we do. So as much as we may deploy fibre out there, and yes, there's many numbers quoted here today on the number of homes connected. And that's where the rubber really hits the road. Are we really connecting the amount of homes we should be connecting rather than just rolling out the...
Are you, perhaps you can give us a view with regard to some of the targets that you've made so far. We know South African consumers are slightly under pressure, despite the fact that this might be a service that they would love to have, but perhaps the change in their back pockets doesn't necessarily agree with their desires.
So let me just comment from an Openserve, open access perspective. We would deal with service providers who then deal with the end consumer.
Okay.
So for us, it's a case of what are those packages being afforded to the end user to be able to afford them to connect to that type of service. So our pricing in the market is pretty standard. I think for all of us out here, the pricing to the service provider market is pretty standard. Then value-added services on top of that dictate what the price to the end user is. And I think that's where we need to start working on. How do you get that price to the end user down to a level that becomes equitable for them to start to utilize the service itself?
Yeah, in our experience, and I mean, Neil probably has similar experience, is that once you are open access, there's actually fierce competition among ISPs to reduce costing. So we see on our open access portal that ISPs are very cognizant of what others are offering and are really undercutting each other. So we see that the pricing really drops through the floor the moment that you have a real open access network.
Yeah, and I think fibre is already comparable to ADSL prices. I think there's no real premium anymore. It's really just a technology change, and it's putting ADSL under pressure too. You know, to move down and provide more value, and hence we're seeing 1 megabit per second services, and that cost coming down of ADSL as well. So it's applying pressure across the copper spectrum or the copper infrastructure as well.
Martin, you wanted to add to that?
Just on the competition matter, I think we have seen some very restrictive practices, and let's call a spade in attempted land grab of office parks and business parks and so forth. And like Prenesh makes a very good point, you know, if in the end you have to add to the cost of the user, and that's the only way to keep competitors out, then it's clearly not good for those businesses. You know, we supply services nationally, and the most expensive services are the ones where we have to add almost the entire service value, the same number, you know, whatever the customer pays, he pays double that if he's in some of these office parks and so forth. Now that is not synergistic, and it's exclusive. It's a land grab which is not conducive to competition. Let's rather differentiate on the quality of the service, the quality of the installation, and potentially the quality of the applications and the experience on the network, than grabbing land and sitting on it, you know.
Exactly. Telling it like it is, quite clearly, gentlemen, and that's what we want. We've got about 4 minutes left of the conversation, so naturally I'd like to get your closing remarks, not only on the future that fibre does present to the economy, but also the rate of rollout that we're seeing, and more importantly with the participation of some foreign investors like a Chinese corporation which deals with the manufacturing of fibre optic cable, which will be established in Durban. You know, does this also bring a new element into the mix where you can hopefully procure this investment and infrastructure at a cheaper price? Abraham, let's get your closing remarks. We'll make our way across the table to Prenesh.
I think we're in the middle of a perfect storm of everything coming together. We have content being delivered for the first time over the top to subscribers. We have influx of investment in South Africa on infrastructure. We have the level of competition increasing. We have the demand from subscribers wanting these faster services. So I think we're right now in the middle of a story that we're seeing play out, where we have a rapid uptake in fiber optic services, and that we have a accelerating demand for broadband services in South Africa. And I think, yeah, it's just all coming together now.
Martin?
We're definitely in a very exciting time. Like I said in the beginning, it seems to all be coming together at the moment. You know, we've got the international connectivity, we've got the internet bandwidth, we've got the fiber carrying and connecting all the towns and so forth. It's really time for fiber to the home to get to its full value. It will certainly change the way people live and they experience the world. It will certainly improve our economy. It will certainly provide more jobs, and it will certainly educate our people, our children better than what is happening at the moment. It's difficult to find a negative to this.
Neil?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic time. And we're all in here, you know, fighting in the trenches, as we said. But the only one that's going to benefit is South Africa, ultimately. It's going to take the country a leap forward, and I think people underestimate how much fibre is actually going to be deployed over the next three years. I think 360,000 by 2019 is a way underestimation of what's actually going to happen.
Sure.
And it will leap us forward, and we saw that in the world rankings the other day, where we leapt up for the first time in 5 years up, and it was purely due to ICT, where we dropped down in all other categories. And I think the consumer just don't get it yet. They're being educated, but it's one of those things where us in this industry, we can see the future to a degree, and we can see that it's really important. This is the arteries and the veins for the information age, which we're laying today. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun, I think, over the next couple of years.
Prenesh, with the arteries and the veins providing the blood flow, I take it the heart is beating quite rapidly then.
So let's not talk about bloodshed in competition, since we're talking about arteries. No, but realistically, so I think the competition is great. I think the country is going to benefit from all this competition. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that yesterday we're talking fiber, but we need to start talking broadband because we have broadband infrastructure, and be that mobile broadband, copper, broadband over copper, broadband over fiber, because I think that's what will fundamentally change the country. I also think that as we start to go down the fiber route, we need to be wise about the way we deploy fiber. It's pointless making infrastructure investments in areas where you aren't going to see a return and no one really benefits from it. Yeah. So it comes back to the earlier point, should all of us be deploying in the same sort of areas and those types of things. I think it will allow us to get a different type of skill set into the country. I was talking about those artisanal type trades. So all of the things I think, and yes, it is a perfect storm. We're building all the right things now to take the country forward. What I think will happen in the next couple of years, we may have many players in the next sort of 18 months to 2 years. And as this starts to roll out, I think that fiber market will consolidate, and we've seen that in many markets previously. So for the end user, I think these next 2 to 3 years are really exciting times. Lots of fiber players out there, lots of access to connectivity, and I think the competition will drive down the prices. And then as that market starts to consolidate, I think we'll end up in a much more stable telecoms broadband market in the South African economy.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. With an outlook like that, where it's difficult to find any negative spots, not only is the outlook when it comes to broadband in South Africa with the glass half full, but it almost certainly seems as though it is overflowing. Thank you so much for your contribution today. And that's a wrap of this discussion on the economics of fiber networks. A big thank you once more to my guests in studio, Prenesh Padayachee, Managing Director of Wholesale Services at Openserve, Niel Schoeman, Founder and Chief Executive of Vumatel, Marten Scheffer, who's the General Manager of Network Engineering at Neotel, and Abraham van der Merwe, MD of Frogfoot Networks. That's been our discussion for today. Join us again next time. Until next time, though, it's goodbye from me and the team.